Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. We'll get started in just one moment. Hold tight for just one moment. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Thanks again, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, all about volunteer engagement and safe routes to school. I'm Holly Nickel. I'm the Coalitions and Equity Manager at the National Partnership, and I'll be the moderator for today's call. A little bit about us first. We're a nonprofit working to advance safe walking and biking to and from school for kids of all races, income levels, and abilities. And we do this in support of creating healthy communities for everybody. And we do this through a number of ways. We seek to improve the quality of life for kids, families, and communities, and we advance policy change throughout multiple levels, the federal, state, regional, and local levels. We catalyze support for safe, healthy, and active communities, and we share our deep expertise in a number of ways, including providing learning opportunities such as the webinar today. Before we get into it, I'd like to cover some really brief housekeeping items. I want to acquaint you with what you might be seeing on your screen. To the left is the GoToWebinar viewer, through which you'll see the presentation. And to the right is the GoToWebinar control panel, where you'll raise your hand, ask questions, and select the audio mode that you'll use, either your computer or telephone. And please note your control panel will collapse automatically when you're not using it. So to keep it open, if you'd like to keep it open, you can click the view on the menu and uncheck auto hide control panel. As for the audio controls, as I said, two options for listening today, telephone or your mic and speakers. If you have sound problems with one selection, try the other option, but we'll do our best to field any issues. Just send us a chat message. Okay, and even though you all are muted today, we want to hear your input. And you can do this by using the question box to ask the speakers questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar. We'll try to answer if there's any time at the end. And a reminder, after viewing today's presentation, you might want to view it again or send the link to some of your buddies. And if that's the case, you can do it for free by going to SafeRoutesPartnership.org and clicking on the resource tab heading, then clicking on webinars in the list on the left-hand side of the page. All past webinars are stored there for your viewing pleasure. So, they're a great resource, so I urge you to visit that site. Okay, and now for our speakers. We have excellent speakers today with us. I'll start with Lucy Nair. Since 2007, Lucy Nair and Tacoma Park Safe Routes to School have empowered 5 local schools, supported a culture of walking and biking, and engaged all in a community of health and inclusion. Lucy uses a multi-pronged approach: education, infrastructural changes, and community building that engages volunteers and supports the goals of creating a walkable, bikeable area. In addition to annual walking and biking events, Lucy offers safety education for all grade levels, pedestrian safety activities, bike rodeos, and the I Can Shine Bike Camp for individuals with special needs. Lucy's signature event, the Tacoma Park Safe Routes to School 5K Challenge, brands the program locally and establishes a platform for outreach and education. The safety-themed 5K race raises funds for the school for pedestrian bike safety, health, and fitness programming. Moving on to Callie. Callie Mersman is the Safe Routes to School coordinator for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District and City of Cleveland, as well as an avid bicyclist and active transportation advocate. In her free time, Callie is increasing bicycle and pedestrian activity and awareness through reintroducing the Open Streets movement to Cleveland. Last but not least, Vanessa. Vanessa Casio is the lead community liaison at Living Street Alliance, a nonprofit advocacy based in Tucson, and is part of their Safe Routes to School team. She became passionate about livable and equitable community development in 2014 when she began coordinating the Safe Routes to School program in the city of South Tucson, working with predominantly low-income Latino communities. She continues to work with these Southside neighborhoods and their school community support biking and walking for youth and their families. Welcome, everybody. Before our speakers highlight their volunteer engagement efforts, I'd like to start with just really briefly highlighting some findings from a survey that the National Partnership conducted late last year to find out more about volunteer engagement. The findings hopefully will give a brief and basic insight into volunteer engagement and will be a jumping off point for our speakers to talk about their own experiences. So as you know, some programs have paid staff and call on volunteers when needed, and then others are entirely volunteer run. And either way, volunteers are really essential for the program, but you know, as we know, can be really hard to find and retain. Next slide. So in hopes about finding out more about volunteer engagement, National Partnership conducted a survey to help identify the challenges and successes regarding volunteer engagement. So we surveyed and interviewed volunteers and coordinators, both paid and unpaid, to provide more insight. So we conducted 10 key informant interviews and sent out surveys. The respondents were from all across the U.S. and represented various community settings, urban, suburban, and rural. 155 people completed the nationwide survey in total, which kind of broke down to 73 coordinators and 82 volunteers. Next slide. So first, let's talk about some of the challenges. There are general challenges, and then we identified additional challenges in low-income schools and or schools that are culturally diverse. So the general challenges are, of course, time and availability. Always competing time commitments was really the main cause of limited participation, and the biggest reason that volunteers also thought about resigning from their positions. And then on top of that, 80% of the respondents reported that a flexible volunteer schedule was super important to retaining their services. In addition to that, matching skills to appropriate volunteer assignments was really important to recruit and retain volunteer services. So you wouldn't want to have a volunteer that is really excited and pumped up for social media and has skills in social media just to sit at a table to hand out pamphlets or what have you. You'd really want them to also do the social media for your program. So not matching volunteers with their appropriate skills result in opportunities lost from the program, such as that really great social media presence. And it also jeopardizes the chance that volunteers will stick around. So we really want to make sure that we're matching skills with the appropriate assignments. Also found as a challenge recruiting and sustaining a solid volunteer pool. Of course, you know, it takes a lot of time and effort to get people interested in volunteering. And, you know, a small volunteer pool just adds to the stress of finding a succession of volunteers. Next slide, please. So some challenges in low-income and or culturally diverse schools include, again, time and availability, but it was a little bit different than just, you know, general time and availability challenges. Parents and other family members, other caretakers that might be interested in volunteering are really overstressed in low-income and culturally diverse schools, and maybe working full-time or juggling multiple jobs, and so they really don't have the time and availability to serve. The schools many times are understaffed, and they're already, you know, the staff is already serving additional support functions for students, and as a result, their availability to support the program may be really limited. Immigration status was another challenge that was found in these schools. You know, in some communities, immigration status fears are really having a negative effect on school-related engagement of community members and families. Background checks were another challenge in some communities. You know, when you require a background check, either you know, the person might be not wanting to volunteer because of their immigration status or prior convictions, or the inability to pay the fee to obtain the background check, so that can be a challenge. And then language and culture. So in these communities and in these schools, especially with large immigrant populations, language barriers can lead to limited parental engagement. And then also norms, beliefs, and preferences just really vary from population to population. And then therefore, successful engagement strategies will really need to be tailored to each community. Okay, next. Some general strategies that respondents reported, really simple, kind of common sense strategies, but ones that I think are limited by time. Coordinators and just don't really have the time a lot of times to really focus on implementing these strategies well. So the strategies that were given were: engage in advanced planning, be organized, get commitment from your school district and administration ahead of time, convey the value of student walking and biking to school, meeting the staff prior to your program efforts. It can help pave the way to better communicate with them, and connecting early on gives you time to work out the parameters for background checks and fingerprinting and that sort of thing, addressing any logistical glitches that could arise. Again, respecting volunteer time and ability. Like we've said, use a flexible volunteer schedule. Respondents really said that using a flexible volunteer schedule really helped retain them as volunteers. Hold meetings when people are available and not during work hours, that sort of thing. The next one, make it fun. Obviously, people love fun, and when they connect in a volunteer environment with each other and they're having fun, they'll be more invested in serving for Safe Routes to School. And then lastly, everyone likes to know they're doing a great job and that they're appreciated. A personal thank you goes a long way, and a lot of people responded that they write, special handwritten thank you notes to volunteers, and the volunteers really, really appreciate that. It's just a small token of your appreciation and something easy that you can do to help retain volunteers. Next. So we want to, additional strategies in low-income schools and culturally diverse schools. Building trust was a really big one. It's easier said than done, obviously, but the most successful programs in low-income schools really pinpoint trusting relationships as their success. It takes time, but it's really important. Sometimes it takes years, but we really need to be building that trust. And one person talked about how, the people, the community, the kids in the school really want to see that you have a vested interest in them above just the program. You need to be visible, and you need to convey why you're there, who you are, what you stand for, and why it's important to their school and to their lives. We need to make sure that programs are culturally and linguistically relevant. Again, tailoring the culture and language is best, and you can do that in different ways. Next, we really need to be supporting other goals. Safe Routes to School is certainly a coordinator's priority. However, by supporting and contributing to other programs and needs, it shows that the Safe Routes to School program isn't there to only zap resources and take up time. Showing a larger commitment to the school community can really result in more connection. Also, the school may not be the most trusted or effective place for recruitment to occur. Instead, we really need to get to know where the community members gather and then implement education and a call to volunteer in trusted gathering places. For example, like church or other gathering space to implement a bike education effort. And that was just a really brief overview of what we found with the survey. I hope this can serve as kind of a jumping off point for the speakers. They'll talk to us about real life challenges and real life strategies that they use. So now I'll hand over the presentation to Lucy, and she can tell us about her experiences.
Okay, Lucy Nair here in sunny Tacoma Park. It's 72 degrees today, and I'm really happy to be with all of you sharing some of my experiences with parent and volunteer engagement. As you can see, I have 7 tips, so this is not a magic number. It's just that when you go to research anything online these days, it's always sort of framed in 3 tips to reduce belly fat, 8 tips for successful investing. So I decided I would do 7 tips for volunteer engagement. Thank you, Holly, for the introduction, and that gave you a brief overview of what I do here in Tacoma Park. So I'll jump straight to the 2 programs where I require the most volunteers, and we'll talk a little bit about how I go about doing that. The first one is a 5K that I do every year. This year it's Cheers to 10 years, and the first year I didn't promise anything except a wish that we would be able to make it to 10 years, and so now we're really excited that 10 years later we are still hosting this 5K where families from all 5 schools come out and participate in a road race with the theme of pedestrian education. And the planning for such an event starts about 9 months earlier. So one area of volunteer engagement is I need a committee of dedicated volunteers to work with me throughout that 9-month period. So that's one kind of volunteer that I'm looking for. And then the day before and the day of the event, I need 30 to 40 volunteers to help us pull off this 5K road race, which 10 years ago started with 350 individuals. We were so excited we had that many people register and come out for the event. Last year we had over 1,500, so it's grown, and so has our need for volunteers. The other activity that I do that requires a certain brand of volunteers is the I Can Shine Bike Camp, and perhaps some of you are familiar with I Can Shine. It's a program that offers a bicycle camp, learn to ride camp for individuals with disabilities, and we hold that here for 1 week each summer for up to 30 riders who come every day for 75 minutes, which means that I need 60 volunteers who also come every day, and they need to be here for 90 minutes each day for 5 days. So you can see this is a big ask, and it takes a special kind of person. So tip number 1 is, tip number 1 is the asking people. And so here's a picture of a friend of mine with one of the campers at the camp. I ask friends, parents, teachers, coworkers, family, I like to joke, the person on the elevator, anybody who I come in contact with. And of course I use digital means to recruit volunteers, but I do like to ask people in person as well, because what I really try to do is in the asking to express just how much passion I have for this particular event that's coming up, and to share that passion, it gets other people excited, and then they can't help but say yes. I also think about groups, organizations, companies who have a connection to the theme of the event, and ask them to come out sort of in force. So I have 3 or 4 different companies or organizations who make it part of their social fabric of their organization to come out and volunteer at the event, and they take a lot of pride in that, and it forms great bonds within their organization, as well as helps me a lot because I can get as many as 10 or 12 volunteers from one particular place. So the one thing that I like to do that's effective is I try to make it seem like this is so much fun and so great, and the people that we're working with are so wonderful that it's sort of like a best kept secret, and that if you're in on it, you're in on a really great secret that invites you to something so fun and rewarding, and that seems to carry over, and people come really excited and ready to work. So tip number 2, I do make big promises, and I do try to keep them. I try really hard to interact with each of the volunteers that comes out for me. And you can see in this picture, there are a lot of young people who've come out to work at the camp, and I promise them the highlight of their summer. And so I check in with them a lot, and I try to gauge how they're doing. This is a time-intensive commitment, and it's an emotional commitment. They're working really hard. They run a lot. It's physical. It's taxing in a lot of ways. So I check in with them often and try to build a relationship that's genuine so that I can tell how they're doing and see where I can help them to be satisfied with their experience. And in tip number 3, as Holly was saying, it's really important to make your volunteer assignments according to individuals' expertise. So imagine my luck when I met a woman who told me that she loved spreadsheets. Well, not everybody loves spreadsheets, but when you need somebody to input data, you need them to love the spreadsheet, and you wouldn't want to ask them then to wear the dolphin outfit. You would want them to work on your spreadsheet. So an important thing is to listen to your volunteers, listen to what they're telling you they like to do, and then try to match them up with things that match their interests and abilities. Tip number 4 is to make your expectations clear, make rules, and then I like to say that we can break the rules sometimes too. So in this, oops, I think I skipped one. So here I had a rule that no one under 16 could volunteer for the camp, but this young man in the orange shorts was under 16, and he was one of the best volunteers that I had. And this year he'll be 16, so he'll be able to do it legitimately, but I did have to break the rule for him because he was so good. Other rules that I make and also break are in terms of the commitment that people make. When they make it, I really expect them to follow through. And so accountability is huge for us here. So I joke that there are no baptisms, birthdays, weddings, or bar mitzvahs. And people know that when they get involved. Of course, I've had people who volunteered for several years in a row, and it kind of becomes a joke, but I think they also do take it seriously because they know that once they make that commitment, I am expecting them to come through for me. So here we are. These individuals have volunteered with me for 9, 10 years. The gentleman there tried to break up with me on the phone once, and I told him that he wasn't allowed to do that. So he only comes for the one part that he's really excellent at, and I can count on him every year. I don't count on him throughout the year, but he knows that on that race day, he's ready to help me out. So I've been able to keep him on board in that way. So sometimes they don't have to give a full commitment of 9 months, but they can give you a few hours on a Sunday morning. I like to welcome the volunteers at the event. I like to have their expectations in writing, so when they come to sign up, they know what's expected of them. It's all very clear. And, you know, these women are smiling at 6 a.m., so I suppose we're doing something right here. I do give away T-shirts. These T-shirts in particular are sought after, and the individuals keep them and bring them back and wear them the next year, which is also a money saver. Once they know what's expected and they're doing something that they're good at, they feel empowered and happy to be part of something that's really positive and fun. So I do, as Holly was saying, like to thank the volunteers in a variety of ways. Of course, you can do your sort of blanket digital thank you, and but I do like to talk with people in person and express my gratitude. I do also write thank you notes by hand if I feel like someone has done something, above and beyond, and I have time to do that. It's really something that I like to do, and people appreciate that a lot. When you make it fun and welcoming and personal, and you have food, um, people feel a connection to something, and they might even ask you if they can come back and volunteer, and that's what you want. So these are some of the examples of testimonials that I've gotten from people actually thanking me for the opportunity to volunteer. A lot of these are about the bike camp because it's such a wonderful experience for everyone involved, the riders and the volunteers. But even in the last one, thanks for last night's meeting, I came away very inspired and excited to help the community. So even meetings can be fun, and people can thank you for that if you make it like that. So lastly, I just want to say that we've all been in a meeting when the question of volunteering comes up, and suddenly everyone has to pick stubborn little pills off their sweater, and you can't get eye contact with anyone. So I hope that with these 7 tips, you'll find more people looking you in the eye and raising their hands to help you volunteer. That's it from Tacoma Park.
Hi, everyone. This is Callie Mersman. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to be covering the origins and development of a volunteer school walking team in Cleveland, Ohio, on the southeast side of town, and how we've recruited and engaged volunteers. I'll start with a little bit of background about our community in Cleveland. For those of you that don't know, we're in the very northern part of Ohio, right up on the shore of Lake Erie. We are an urban Rust Belt community with high poverty and struggles with vacancy and blight in our neighborhoods. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about the structure of our local Safe Routes to School program, since that's really influenced how our main volunteer program has taken shape. The Ohio Department of Transportation has a district-wide school travel plan and Safe Routes program template for large school districts like ours. We have 68 K through 8 grade buildings in our school district. And in 2015, we launched this district-wide Safe Routes planning approach with several partners whose logos you can see up on the slide, as well as the help of a consultant team. This process helped us create data and come up with action steps and recommendations around the 5 Safe Routes to School E's for our kindergarten through 8th grade students. One of the products of this planning process was a network of designated school routes. You can see a map here for one of our schools. These designated school routes are streets in the neighborhoods around each of the school buildings that help us prioritize areas for infrastructure improvements as well as programmatic interventions like the school walking team initiative that I'm discussing today. So unfortunately, in early 2017, about 2 years after our district-wide Safe Routes program kicked off, there was a terrible tragedy in our community when a student was kidnapped and murdered on her way to school one morning. The incident was a catalyst for many community members, especially faith leaders in the neighborhood, who came out onto the streets each morning as students were walking to school and really became much more aware of the neighborhood environment that students were contending with each day as they walked to and from school. These faith leaders quickly formed a grassroots coalition called Safe Schools, Safe Streets, and their energy and passion for being there for students and for addressing some neighborhood challenges fit right in with recommendations that were included in our initial Safe Routes to School travel plan, like establishing walking school buses and engaging different community groups. The school walking teams that resulted are groups of adult volunteers. They're each led by one of the faith leaders. And these teams adopt a school. They recruit volunteers that are stationed along neighborhood streets for about an hour during arrival in the morning or school dismissal in the afternoon. The adult volunteers provide extra eyes on the street and security as students are walking to and from school. So we know, as Holly alluded to in the survey results, that attracting and retaining volunteers can be pretty difficult. Our initial model was to have a team lead through an organization. So far, this has mostly been filled by those initial pastors that stepped up in the Safe Streets and Safe Schools Coalition. These pastors engage and recruit other neighborhood organizations and institutions. And the idea is that different partners would adopt different days of the week at a particular school. In practice, it hasn't turned out quite this organized. We do have a number of individual or unaffiliated volunteers that are very dedicated to the program. But this type of structure provided us with a defined and specific ask for potential organizations that might partner with us in the neighborhood. We identified 5 pilot schools to start this model with the idea that we could perfect the approach and that it could then be replicated in other buildings across the school district. On this slide, it's just another graphic that shows how our teams are organized. We try not to ask for too much of a time commitment for any one volunteer, since we know that their time is precious and availability is limited. Basically, each team leader works to staff the designated school routes around the school building that they've adopted. And we're shooting for 5 to 10 people in the morning as well as the afternoon around each of the school buildings. So with that programmatic structure, one of the pieces that was really challenging for us when we first started this was setting up and paying for background checks, making sure all of the volunteers were properly registered, and some of those procedural things. This is actually one of the ways that our Safe Routes to School program was really able to lend some institutional and organizational support to the grassroots efforts that the faith leaders started. Through the City of Cleveland, we were able to complete background checks for our school walking team volunteers using the same system that they use for their new hires. So because the city is a main partner in the Safe Routes to School initiative and a leader locally, they're able to fold these volunteers kind of into their established system for background checks. We've also established a volunteer orientation session where the volunteers learn about their program structure and how to interact with students, how to document and report issues that they encounter on neighborhood streets like overgrown vegetation or speeding vehicles. In this way, the extra eyes on the street that the volunteers provide are not only there for students and security, but also help us identify and address environmental issues that impact the quality of students' journeys traveling to and from school and improve the overall quality of our Safe Routes to School services. So we formatted our volunteer orientation through kind of boots on the ground with our initial 70 volunteers. In April 2017, we held 2 combination walking school bus and walk audit trainings with these initial volunteers. There was an in-class portion to the training where they got some background information about Safe Routes to School in general, which helped us gain recognition and some additional buy-in to the Safe Routes program district-wide, as well as covering volunteer expectations and roles. And then we went with them outside to do an outdoor portion where we walked around the neighborhood. You can see one of our schools there in the background. And we taught the volunteers how to note and document things like unsecured vacant buildings along the designated school routes, overgrown vegetation that might need trimming, and other safety concerns. In terms of recruitment, we've tried to spread the word as widely as possible using both online, electronic, and paper flyers. We have a database of Safe Routes to School stakeholders that we blast things out with. We try and hold volunteer orientations at a variety of times. And as we're building this program up, we plan to have them regularly. But we have some during the day when people that don't work regular hours might be available, or people that are participating as part of their day job can come. And then evening volunteer sessions when people that are doing this kind of outside of work or perhaps work during the day are able to come. We present at community meetings whenever possible, whether it's block clubs or church clubs or ward clubs or any sort of group. We talk about it as much as possible to as many people as possible, and have really found that word of mouth and person-to-person relationships have been a very effective recruiting tool. Having partners like the faith leaders also allows us to tap into their personal and organizational networks. So as they're building out their teams for their adopted schools, they have that pool of people to draw from. So as was mentioned earlier in the webinar, we know that many of our parents have a lot of obligations already and a lot of commitments. Our school district is really focused on pulling parents into schools to be engaged in students' learning and to be present for parent-teacher conferences and things like that. So while parents certainly are welcome to volunteer with us and are key volunteers in some cases, they're not our main pool of recruitment. This program is really an opportunity for community members to support the schools in the neighborhood and the students traveling through the neighborhoods on their way to school. So like I've mentioned, we draw heavily from the faith community, neighborhood block clubs, community development organizations, other companies, institutions, or organizations that may have buildings or operations in the neighborhoods around the school buildings. We work closely with the police and outreach through community police relations. We also coordinate with seniors and retirees, college students, and crossing guards, and have had some success in aligning with other local initiatives such as Age Friendly Cleveland, which focuses a lot on social inclusion opportunities for senior citizens. So through feedback from our volunteers and the faith leaders that have helped us to build the teams as part of Safe Schools, Safe Streets, we got a lot of feedback about how we could be more flexible to accommodate volunteer needs. When volunteers join the program, they're issued a yellow vest, like is pictured here, as part of their uniform. But we are very agnostic about kind of what shape their movement through the neighborhood takes when they're on post. Volunteers, if they would like to, are encouraged to walk along designated school routes or kind of patrol a specific block. They can stay moving on foot. Or if they have mobility limitations or feel more comfortable, they can sit on a lawn chair on a specific street corner or even on their own porch. The idea is just to provide a supportive community presence for students as they're traveling to and from school. Also, being in Cleveland, we have some winter weather to contend with some of the time, so we've ordered car magnets that allow volunteers to brave those really cold single-digit or negative winter months by patrolling in cars. So to conclude, our main lessons learned through this process are to start where there's energy. We would not have been able to build nearly a robust program like we have now if the grassroots energy and initiative had not emerged and been able to match with what our preparation through the Safe Routes planning process had kind of mapped out for us. I'd also encourage you to talk about your program as much as possible to as many people as possible through partnerships with the school district and the city of Cleveland and the community partners. We have several key people that are out in different parts of the community talking with different people. We all just talk about this as much as we can wherever we are in the hopes that someone will be interested and want to join. And that kind of leads into the third bullet, which is tapping into established networks, building personal relationships and building on personal relationships. This is the type of volunteer activity, as many are, that can be a lot more fun to do if you have a friend or a partner to join with you. And so we encourage groups of coworkers or church members or friends or neighbors to come out together as a group to join the school walking teams. It's also important that programs address real needs. In our school travel plan, we have several potential programs that can help improve safety and improve the journey to and from school for kids that are walking and biking. But this one really hit the sweet spot of where parents' concerns were that we heard about through parent surveys, as well as what kids were experiencing on their way to and from school. And finally, as has been mentioned several times, appreciate your volunteers, tell them thank you, show them that you care. In the structure of this program, we've made a conscious decision not to rely too much on incentives because of budgetary uncertainties into the future, and just wanting to be sure that the motivation for being a volunteer is really centered on the value provided to the community. We're trying really hard to build a model that's sustainable and replicable. And when we think about giving things like gift cards or stipends, we don't know that we'll always be able to offer those. And so we are really focused on building community goodwill and that feeling of reward through things like thank yous and celebrations that have been discussed before, rather than financial stipends. So if you have any questions, we love to talk about this. I'm Callie, the Safe Routes Coordinator at the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. I work closely with Freddie and Marka in Cleveland City Planning, and we would love to hear from you and talk more.
Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Vanessa Casio again, and I'm with Living Streets Alliance. And we are a local nonprofit advocacy organization based in Tucson, Arizona. And we manage the Safe Routes to School Tucson program in partnership with the City of Tucson. But it's actually one of our many programs. For instance, we have one of our most visible programs is our biannual Open Streets event called Ciclovia Tucson, which brings about 60,000 people out in our streets every year. Our main advocacy work this year is really focused on getting a complete streets policy passed in our city. So one of the things that we're always trying to consider is how are we weaving all of our programs together in a way that help to push forward our advocacy initiatives. And so just to give you all just a little bit of context, let's see here. There we go. Just to give you a little bit of context in case you're not familiar, we are in Tucson, which is about 60 miles north of the Mexican-U.S. border. And so that heavily influences our local community and who our program serves. With Safe Routes, we prioritize our programming in low-income, high-need areas and mostly Latino communities, and most of the households we work with are either bilingual or come from Spanish monolingual backgrounds. And so also in thinking about community context, we also have a significant immigrant population who are often transient. And even in the last year, some of our school districts have seen vast declines in their student enrollment due to fears of deportation. And I mention this because it makes a huge difference when we start talking about who and how we're recruiting parents and families as volunteers and champions, and maybe folks who aren't participating in, quote unquote, traditional civic engagement, but just also being mindful of the stability of families and overall challenges that they are experiencing. So with this in mind, we don't necessarily have a traditionally structured volunteer program because so much depends on the context of the school community, their needs, and where they are even thinking about and considering active transportation as an option. So for us, when we're thinking about volunteers to lead programming, whether it's walking school bus or bike clubs, the goal for us is really important to have folks from these neighborhoods and communities leading the charge, because they're the ones who can really spread the goals of Safe Routes among their networks. And this isn't easy. And as Holly had mentioned before, it takes a lot of time and trust to build these relationships. And for us, that means it takes our staff time, it takes boots on the ground, and it takes being embedded in schools and building relationships with staff and parents. And so with that in mind, a lot of times we see how schools can be safe spaces for families, as they are the ones also trying to build trust with families and sort of being a hub to connect them to other resources. So many of these schools that we work with don't have traditional forms of engagement like PTOs or parent groups in that traditional way. So many of the schools are looking to non-traditional ways to connect with families, whether it be like hosting cafecitos, which is sort of an informal parent gathering with coffee and sweet bread and connecting with principal and school staff, or having a lot of schools we work with have community liaisons, which actually their job is to connect families with additional resources. Getting families with their power turned back on, or we've worked with liaisons who have told us, kids don't walk because they don't have good shoes. So how can we work maybe that into a walking program where maybe we can partner with a local store to get incentivize students to get shoes, when they walk, things like that. And I think for us as a program, we're always looking to see how we can bolster these schools' efforts in bringing resources and building trust and leveraging those opportunities, because so much of it is dependent on the school. So one of my sort of mantras in thinking about how we're engaging families and volunteers is really about meeting people where they're at. And one really good example of this most recently was when we were asked to do a walking school bus training for parents at a school that actually lead walking school bus routes already every Friday. And the teacher who organizes the routes thought this would be a really good way to empower families to take on more of a leadership role, because the teachers were the ones leading the routes, and parents would join the walking groups because they really enjoyed spending that time with their kids and getting to know the other kids. So the teacher thought that they would be ready for like a walking volunteer training, which, most of those trainings are pretty straightforward, really emphasizing the educational piece and reinforcing some of the walking safety rules and things like that. So when we put together this training, what ended up happening is that it actually ended up sparking a whole different conversation about neighborhoods and issues that families saw in their neighborhoods when it came to barriers to biking and walking, and really asking me questions like, who do I call if I see a loose dog? Or, is there something I can do about these overgrown weeds on the sidewalk in my neighbor's yard? Like, does the city help with that? And so we ended up really having a robust conversation about resources that the city can provide, but also how they can be advocates in even their own neighborhood. So I think this is a really good example, because we kind of came in with this agenda of a traditional volunteer model that didn't quite fit for this group, that they weren't really ready for. And on the same hand, they were really excited just to show up and support their kids in being healthier, and showing up to the walking groups with the support of teachers. And that's really huge. And I think that having that conversation really put that in perspective. So as we're embedded in these schools and working with sort of a variety of different people, like what was mentioned before, is providing a variety of ways for people to get involved. So here's a picture of somebody we worked with, Miss Debbie, who works at one of our Safe Route schools and actually walks to school herself to get to work and lives in the neighborhood. And so she started to get involved with us when we had this project to do a series of community painted intersection murals. And she was so super excited to help us out with this project. And she's the kind of person that will never be keen on leading a bike train or leading a walking school bus, but this was something that she could really get excited about. And so for us, the question is, as we start to attract folks and who kind of start to gravitate towards us, what are we doing to provide them with resources or opportunities so that they can kind of work their way to becoming champions and advocates themselves. So here pictured below is Miss Debbie again at one of our digital storytelling workshop trainings. So this was a part of our Complete Streets initiative, where we had a group of adults and actually youth get trained on how to use digital media to tell their story of how they navigate and move in the city. And so her story really focused on why walking in her neighborhood is really important, and also some of the barriers that she sees when it comes to having access to safe and walkable environments. And one of the things that we have felt pretty committed to is some sort of compensation or resources for volunteers in terms of providing them with stipends. There's always that challenge of sustainability, but I think that we've also been able to seek other sources of funding outside of Safe Routes to School funding to make sure that we are either getting gift cards from local grocery stores or other ways that we are bringing resources into some of these low-income households. One of the things that we've heard over and over again from communities we work with is that youth are really one of the greatest assets. So how do we cultivate young leaders in our work? And so we've actually recruited them to be volunteers as either youth bike leaders or even with our mobile bike repair program, doing some basic bike maintenance. And we've been able to send groups to even the Youth Bike Summit in Washington, D.C., but also providing training for them here locally and thinking about connecting them with our local bike cooperative to take mechanic classes or doing bike trainings with them and really building up on their skills. And they actually are a really valuable asset when it comes to helping out with our programs. And lastly, I just want to end with a couple of things that Holly mentioned but we do have some challenges in terms of trying to engage folks who are not necessarily documented, because sometimes the district requires background and fingerprinting. And so a lot of times we've had to find other ways to engage them. But also I think one of our strengths is that we've partnered with some grassroots organizations to help connect those folks to really important resources, whether it's workshops on getting to know their rights or other sorts of resources for undocumented folks. I think that's really valuable when we're talking about building trust, and also being really cognizant of how much we're asking of our volunteers and being really graceful and mindful when it comes to understanding that these are communities really in flux. So on that, I will leave you with my contact information, because again, we do like to talk about what we're doing here in Tucson, and we feel like we're pretty unique in a lot of ways. So I'll leave you with that.
Great. Thanks so much, all of you, for your really informational and great presentations today about what you guys are doing in practice around volunteer engagement. We do have a few questions, if you'd be so kind to entertain them. One of them is, for each of you, do you have volunteer retention data or input on what volunteers appreciate? And that can be anyone fielding that question.
I don't have any data on that, but I do know that when I do incentivize the volunteer activity, I do try to make it something that's, valuable to the particular volunteer, that isn't just a giveaway that they, would then not utilize, but something that's valuable to them. A higher quality item, or like some of the others said, a gift card, or either sometimes a meal together or something like that.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Another question, Callie, have you found a difference in success between parents as a walking team leader versus community members as walking team leaders? And if so, what is the difference?
We tend to have more community members be interested in the opportunity. In a lot of our neighborhoods, there are people that have lived there for years and really want to support students. They might not have children themselves, or their children might be grown. And this provides a structure for doing that, and then an organized way to plug in and lend value. I wouldn't say that there's much of a difference in terms of their investment once they are involved. So the parents that have come forward and are interested in being volunteers are great. It's just that we tend to have more community members than parents, because there are so many other demands on parents' time.
Thank you. Vanessa, could you say something about the social aspects of your volunteer engagement? You mentioned cafecitos, but why is it important, kind of like the social aspect for the community that you serve?
Yeah, sure. I think it's pretty important only because we work with so many schools that's really sort of having these more informal gatherings really helps to build trust. It's a way that doesn't build upon a certain agenda. We've even hosted block parties before, and it's really interesting the sorts of comments that kind of elicits about where people are at in terms of understanding what's going on in their community, their relationship with the city even, and sort of the types of information that we're gleaning from it is that that this is really important to build trust, and I think that's always an important piece to just overall engagement.
Thank you so much. I want to give a round of applause electronically to our presenters today. I think all of them had their contact information up and would be happy to hear from you with questions or other things. To wrap up, you can go next. I don't want you to forget that we'll have this webinar posted online within 48 hours at saferoutespartnership.org. And then we'll also be sending you a really quick survey and would love to hear your feedback on today's webinar. Our next webinar will focus on safe routes to healthy food and will be held on March 22nd. So look for the registration link in our follow-up email, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you to the presenters as well. See you next time.